there's this, but I can't really, not sure if I can do anything about that.
Minimize it with the line.
Oh, there you go. I see. Perfect. All right. My name is Carissa Fawole. I teach international law, but I focus on international children's rights. So I'm a bit of a chameleon. So I dip into family law and obviously into child law. So today, this paper is in its very early stages, and it works because I was informed that I should be speaking about the best interests of my colleagues. So the idea here is to look at children in situations of forced migration, specifically internally displaced children, and my scope of focus will be Africa, and you'll see why based on the applicable legal instruments that work for internally displaced children in Africa. And so right now, I think my paper will be structured to provide an introduction to internal displacement, because as opposed to refugees and refugee law, it's sometimes not as well understood or talked about or known. So I usually, in papers like this, I provide an introduction, sort of an overview. Then we're obviously going to look at the framework for international children's rights, and the legal framework that responds to situations of internal displacement, and have a closer look at children and internally displaced children, and kind of look at what the best interest offers. Does it offer anything? Is it enough? Do we dispense with it? Are there other principles that we should be using instead? So essentially, I'm looking at what's the utility? Does it help us provide protection and assistance to children in situations of internal displacement? And the reason we look at this is because internally displaced children, including there are other groups like the elderly, women, that are recognized as groups of internally displaced children with special needs. So they're already recognized in the legal framework, but it doesn't necessarily mention the best interest, and that maybe is not significant, but maybe it is. And I would like to interrogate further whether it's necessary. What will it add? What will it assist in terms of the legal framework? And the reason for this is, it could be a very interesting academic exercise. However, we need to, especially talking about international law, we have very great standards, but they need to be implemented and applied and domesticated. And so the hope here is to help direct the implementation of standards that are applicable to internally displaced children in Africa, but in the specific jurisdictions. So in terms of internal displacement, we describe it as a type of internal forced migration. So these individuals have been forced to flee their place of habitual residence due to a number of factors. Conflict, violence, and natural disasters are the two larger categories. Also violations of human rights, climate-induced displacement. But the major thing is they're forced to flee, it's coerced, but they haven't crossed an international border. So that means that for especially those maybe who are displaced due to conflict and violence, they cannot seek protection and assistance under the refugee law. So essentially, internal displacement makes things more difficult. If children or the families are already in poverty, it pushes them further into these difficulties, specifically because they are outside of their communities. Sometimes children are separated from their families. And essentially, you can think of individuals who are in refugee-like situations, but they haven't crossed an international border. They might be in strange communities, they might be in camps, they might be in formal settlements. It makes it very difficult. So in terms of internal displacement, we call them invisible citizens because sometimes they blend in, and there's a large focus on individuals who are in situations of external forced migration. However, internally displaced persons, generally it's just a little less than double the amount of refugees. So it's quite a large number. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center is a center out of Norway, and they provide the best data on internally displaced persons. And so we see at the end of 2022, there were 71.1 million internally displaced persons. And so this is the total number. Some individuals have been displaced for some time, and some were displaced just within that year. And then we have a breakdown. We can see that internal displacement is actually a global problem. There is not a continent that is untouched. Some areas, for example, in Africa, there's conflict and violence are the predominant causes, but in other areas like Asia, we'll see that natural disasters comprise a larger sort of trigger for internal displacement. And then we drill down and look deeper at children, so persons under the age of 18 years. This was statistics taken at the end of 2021, so approximately 25.2 million. And just to give reference, at the larger number we were looking at this time was about 59.1 million. So a good portion of internally displaced persons are actually children. So that's important. So we have an overview of the context of what I'm talking about. And so I think a lot of I'm the second day, so there's some things that other colleagues have touched on. But we have this idea and understanding of children as bearers of rights. So it's balance. Obviously I'm preaching to the choir here. You understand this autonomy, evolving capacities, and vulnerability that really frames the way we conceptualize children in the context of international children's rights and as well domestically. So I'm just highlighting the preambles of the CRC and the African Children's Charter, and we see that there is a focus on children in situations of difficult situations. They need special consideration. And again, we see that mirrored in the African Children's Charter. And specifically here, we'll note the African Children's Charter is actually the first binding treaty or legal instrument that recognizes internally displaced children. It actually predates the other legal instruments that I will talk about that focus on internal displacement. So it recognizes in the Article 23, when it talks about refugee children, in sub 4, it talks about how these protections also are available to internally displaced children, and specifically looking at situations of family separation. Again, the African Children's Charter recognizes the importance to that and expediting family reunification. So in terms of our international response to children's rights, we have the general principles. People have written, are these useful? Are they not? What do they do? Nevertheless, we have and we work with them. And so we have a number of general principles, but one of them is the best interest. And I talk about the best interest a lot of times as a principle we love to hate, because it's very nice in one respect. And this is something I'll look at overall in terms of its applicability to situations of forced migration. Because in the refugee setting, internal displacement provides this point of departure for addressing the rights and rights and needs of internally displaced children. There's something called BID, Best Interest Determination. It's a very formal procedure used by the UNHCR that's actually resource intensive, that is used step by step to make these decisions. And so it becomes this point of departure. Jason Pobjoy, who's an authority on refugee children, he even talks about using the best interest as a form of determining if there's harm that comes to that refugee children are subjected to, and then that's an important aspect for them to satisfy to actually be determined as refugees. So here I would like to interrogate the pros and cons of the best interest, but focus on situations of migration. What can it be used for? Is it just enough to recognize internally displaced children as persons with special needs, or do we need to go more and look at the best interest, or is it that we actually need the remainder of the general principles? And even something I'm sure you're familiar with is the a children's rights approach, which includes the 4 general principles as well as accountability and evolving capacities. Do we need to use those? And so, again, like I said, best interest is the principle we love to hate, because sometimes it's actually overused. It just becomes this tick box. And we say best interests, and really, what does it mean? What does it add? So the overuse is also quite dangerous. So in terms of internal displacement, we have 2 larger frameworks. One is the guiding principles on internal displacement, and those are a set of non-binding recommendations. And essentially, it brings together. There's some legal experts in the 90s that came together, and they looked at international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and refugee law by analogy. And essentially, they interrogated what was missing, and essentially they came to the conclusion that we have adequate legal standards that have been accepted, but they need to be interpreted in a way that is applicable to situations of internal displacement. And they came up with these guidelines. At the African regional level, is the Kampala Convention, and this is a binding treaty on internal displacement. And the reason the African Union felt that it wasn't just enough to have these non-binding standards, they felt that it would be more effective to respond to internal displacement in the context of Africa with these binding standards. And just to give the context, this year, 47% of internally displaced persons who are displaced by conflict and violence are on this continent. So it's quite a significant problem. And so they felt that this was the way forward. And when we look at internally displaced children, we also have the CRC and the African Children's Charter. We can see across the continent wide ratification and domestication of both of these instruments. So that's an overview of the legal framework. And in terms of the best interests of the child, the specific focus on internal displacement, these instruments do not mention the best interests of the child. They do provide specific rights and protections for children, but they don't look at that term. And maybe that's not important, maybe it is. And so just to give an idea, the guiding principles, why they are not binding, they have been widely accepted. And really, one reason for that is actually a restatement of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, refugee law that's already been accepted by the majority of states. Whether it's implemented is another thing, but generally there's acceptance. And for the Kampala Convention, it's really a big deal because Africa is the only region with a binding treaty on internal displacement. And so it is in force. There is some ratifications, it's doing okay. And there have been some states that have domesticated it. Some have not. Some have used the guiding principles to provide legislation on that. And so in terms of the structure, I just want to have a quick explain this. So in terms of the legal response, it looks at pre-displacement, during displacement, and post-displacement. The first prize would be to prevent internal displacement, address the root causes. But we realize that that is something that we want to work towards. However, in reality, we still have to look at protection and assistance during displacement, and also what we call durable solutions, which is essentially moving individuals out of internal displacement so they do not have any protection and assistance requirements that are actually specifically linked to their displacement. So this is the way the frameworks are structured, both in the guiding principles and the Kampala Convention. And so here, as opposed to refugee law, where we look at the best interests of the child, the overarching principle in the law on internal displacement is actually non-discrimination. And when I was thinking about this, I thought maybe this is more important. Maybe I should do a comparison, because even when I look at the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, a number of their decisions talk about non-discrimination. Maybe this is where I should focus and maybe compare the best interests and see whether that this might be the way we go. We should forget about the best interests and focus on non-discrimination. And so, like I mentioned before, these are some of the groups that both frameworks focus on. Obviously, our focus is on children. And so in the Kampala Convention, specifically, it mentions separated and unaccompanied children. So children who are separated from their parents, but maybe are accompanied by an adult, and unaccompanied children, they're on their own. And so there's a recognition of this. And so internal displacement for children is particularly acute. For the first reason is that it's not a short-lived thing. It could be that they could be displaced for months, years, even a decade. They could spend their entire lives. So when looking at their protection and assistance, it's quite significant, because we need to assist children in where they are, and to just be able to respond in terms of the important, sorry, in terms of the length of displacement and how it affects their lives, their development. But also there are child-specific risks or child-intensified risks. One thing I can focus on, for example, are forced recruitment into hostilities and harmful practices, as well as negative coping mechanisms. So these, because children are outside of their communities, their habitual modes of protection, like their communities, their families, they are more vulnerable to these aspects and these risks. Also, for example, forced marriage or trafficking, because internal displacement pushes families into very desperate situations. There are some times where they make bad choices, where, for example, girls are married off early, they're forced into labor, they're trafficked because of this need. And so children are affected by this. So it's another reason for us to focus on internally displaced children. So there's an article by Adiola and Mesmer. They specifically analyze Article 20 or Article 23(4) of the African Children's Charter, because, like I mentioned, it provides rights and protections for internally displaced children. And they talk about adopting a best interest lens for interpreting the obligations to the Kampala Convention. They also mention the importance of non-discrimination and participation. But when I read this, this actually sort of started me to think, why do we need a best interest lens? Why not just a children's rights perspective? So this this article essentially started me thinking about responding to this question. And in terms of domestication, I just want to highlight there kind of, it's interesting in the sense, so there's a Kampala Convention and there's a model legislation. So it's really designed to help states implement the provisions of the Kampala Convention. And here it's much more detailed, and actually does, in terms of access to education and specifically family reunification. It talks about the best interests and incorporates that in a very, I would say it does a very good job. There's also model legislation. There's another protocol that I didn't mention. There's the International Conference of the Great Lakes Regions, which is a sub-regional a body that has also protocols that respond to internal displacement, and they have model legislation. At this point, there are a number of states within Africa that do have responses to internal displacement. One of them is Nigeria, and Nigeria is a party to the Kampala Convention, as well as the CRC and the African Children's Charter, and it has policy, not legislation. There was a bill when I was doing my doctorate. I think they had it was like 2017, and then the bill must have died because it disappeared. But they do have a policy, and it does focus in on individuals with special needs, including children, the elderly, women. And so it does incorporate the best interests of the child there. And in Kenya, I think I didn't put Kenya, that's the last one. They are not a party to the Kampala Convention, but they have also comprehensive legislation which responds to internal displacement. And they have had issues with internal displacement in terms of the post-election violence that happened in 2009, 2010. So I'm going to have a look at those to see what I can learn as well. And so, but this again is what my point of departure is that we need to focus on children as bearers of rights. And so we need to protect them and assist them, but they need to be part of the solution, part of the response. So this is where I am. We'll see if it makes any sense. Maybe I'll focus on non-discrimination and dispense with the best interest of the child. We'll see. But that's what I have for you today. So thank you.